Perfect. All right, cool. We're back. Hey, everybody, back. All right, so it's time for study group time. So we're doing A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. I remembered as soon as I got off. I'm like, what book am I reading? And then I remembered. So, all right, so we're reading our study group material. So for anybody who's joining who doesn't know what this is no longer live for readings. So if you were tuning in wanting a personal reading, that was in the last hour. This hour is dedicated to the study group that we conduct every Wednesday and every Friday after the live. And so today on Wednesdays, we do A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. And so what I essentially do is just specs or parts, chapters, etc. I read, give my commentary, and then that's what we discuss. We discuss the material. We go through some of the topics and the subject matter. Feel free to post your questions or your comments below that have to do with either the material itself, the book itself, have to do with the information that we will go through in the material as you have epiphanies, or if you just want to ask me a topical question about spirituality or anything that's related to that. No personal questions, guys. So any personal questions I won't be answering. I'm just going to skip those. But that's what we're doing, study group time. So I've been meaning to, I had originally designed a little thing where there's like a bar right here on the screen, and then it would say that that's what we're doing, but I think that would kind of get a little bit funky with the words going up and down. So I'm thinking I'm probably going to end up putting something back there where there will be like a chalkboard or something, or a picture where it says study group with the book, with the image of the book, so people can always know what we're promoting or what we're studying that day, right? So all right, cool. Study group time. Okay, so the last place we left off on was on chapter, what is this, chapter, I think we're still in chapter 1, I believe. It's page 13, so we're just on page 13 of the book. Follow along, feel free to read with me or to listen to my voice. And then, like I said, I'll stand and discuss this as well, okay? The arising new consciousness. Most ancient religions and spiritual traditions share the common insight that our normal state of mind is marred by a fundamental defect. However, out of this insight into the nature of the human condition, we may call it the bad news, arises a second insight, the good news of the possibility of a radical transformation of human consciousness. In Hindu teachings, and sometimes in Buddhism also, this transformation is called enlightenment. In the teachings of Jesus, it is salvation, and in Buddhism, it is the end of suffering. Liberation and awakening are other terms used to describe the transformation. The greatest achievement of humanity is not in its works of art, science, or technology, but the recognition of its own dysfunction, its own madness. In the distant past, this recognition already came to a few individuals. A man called Gautama Siddhartha, who lived 2,600 years ago in India, was perhaps the first who saw it with absolute clarity. Later, the title Buddha was conferred upon him. Buddha means the awakened one. At about the same time, another of humanity's early awakened teachers emerged in China. His name was Lao Tzu. He left a record of his teachings in the form of one of the most profound spiritual books ever written, the Tao Te Ching. To recognize one's own insanity is, of course, the arising of sanity, the beginning of healing and transcendence. A new dimension of consciousness had begun to emerge on the planet, a first tentative flowering. Those rare individuals then spoke to their contemporaries. They spoke of sin, of suffering, of delusion. They said, "Look how you live. See what you are doing, the suffering you create." They then pointed to the possibility of awakening from the collective nightmare of normal human existence. They showed the way. The world was not yet ready for them, and yet they were a vital and necessary part of human awakening. Inevitably, they were mostly misunderstood by their contemporaries, as well as by subsequent generations. Their teachings, although both simple and powerful, became distorted and misinterpreted. In some cases, even as they were recorded in writings by their disciples, over the centuries, Many things were added that had nothing to do with the original teachings, but were reflections of a fundamental misunderstanding. Some of the teachers were ridiculed, reviled, or killed. Others came to be worshipped as gods. Teachings that pointed the way beyond the dysfunction of the human mind, the way out of the collective insanity, were distorted and became themselves part of the insanity. And so religions, to a large extent, became divisive rather than unifying forces. Instead of bringing about an ending of violence and hatred through a realization of the fundamental oneness of all life, they brought more violence and hatred, more divisions between people, as well as between different religions and even within the same religion. They became ideologies, belief systems people could identify with, and so use them to enhance their false sense of self. Through them, they could make themselves right and others wrong, and thus define their identity through their enemies. The others, the non-believers or wrong believers, who not infrequently they saw themselves justified in killing. Man made God in his own image. Man made God in his own image. The eternal, the infinite, and unnameable was reduced to a mental idol that you had to believe in and worship as my God or our God. And yet, in spite of all the insane deeds perpetrated in the name of religion, the truth to which they... going on here? I don't know what that is. The truth to which they point still shines at their core. It still shines, however, dimly, through layers upon layers of distortion and misinformation and misinterpretation, actually. It is unlikely, however, that you will be able to perceive it there unless you have at least already had glimpses of that truth within yourself. Throughout history, there have always been rare individuals who experienced a shift in consciousness and realized within themselves that toward which all religious points. To describe that non-conceptual truth, they then use the conceptual framework of their own religions. And I'll stop there for a second because I want to talk about this. And this is something that I personally encountered and went through. This is the reason why I found God. I found God because I refused to accept what the truth that had been established as the Catholic faith or religion. I was raised Catholic. I grew up in the Catholic faith. And as I got older and I got smarter and I got wiser, it occurred to me that these things did not align with what people were saying. People cannot say God is all loving, all forgiving, the idea of all loving, all forgiving does not correlates to you're going to go to hell, because God is not all forgiving when it comes to you, right? So that's what people were saying, and that they mix that all up in their head. And of course, why wouldn't they? Because there's contradictions up the galore in the holy books. And so that wasn't working for me. And this was around the time in my life where I was realizing that I was gay and I was attracted to men. And so I had just gone through puberty and I was trying to figure myself out. And my entire family is Catholic. And so I remember having these walks with my cousin, and I would say to her, I've been reading these books, and I read this book by Sarah Brown, and she says the reason why I'm gay is because I was a female in other lifetimes, or because I chose to come into this lifetime as a male, but I have a female soul. There was all these ideas. And I said, so that makes more sense to me that I would have these other lifetimes, but then I have a lifetime as a male, and I naturally line up with that perspective. And I remember her saying this to me, and she's changed her position on this now, but back then she was still very much devoted to the faith. And so I remember her saying, no, that's what you want to hear. You're just reading what you want to hear. It's not what actually is. And so there was this ideology or this perspective from people in my family where what we were taught and what we were conditioned to believe in and buy into was the absolute truth, and it was unchangeable, unmovable, and undisputable. And that didn't work for me. It did not work for me. What I felt and knew internally did not line up with what I was being told. So it was in that moment that I decided I was no longer going to follow the faith of my family or the faith of my mother, and I was going to find God directly through direct interaction. And we were taught, you can only experience God through a priest or through but I just didn't agree with that, and I felt that we all had access to God. So I, at that point, just kind of said, I'm not going to I'm not going to go that direction anymore. I'm not going to follow this path. And I began looking for answers. And so I began exploring other religious practices, other belief systems, trying to find one that I thought would be better for me or that would align more with what I believed. And it was in that I didn't find myself becoming a different religious person. I just decided that religion was too limiting. Each religion that I've encountered is too limiting, and that it puts everything into a box. And in my mind and in my experience, God does not fit in a box. You can't squeeze God into a box of a concept. So I decided I was just going to have a direct experience with God. And I asked God, show yourself to me. Show me what you truly are, where you truly are, what is truth and what is not. I want to experience it directly with you. And in that is when all of the mystical and around that time is when I started having lots of experiences, and I started to have more direct connection with the divine, which is what I believe. So, and I've never dropped that. And in fact, it's only gotten more intense and more clear for me as time has progressed. I'm not saying that means I'm right and people are wrong. I'm saying that I don't place limitations on God in the way that people who are tied to a religion do. Because I don't limit God to that religious belief system or faith. I allow God to speak to me as it will, and I go with that. I don't put God in a box. I try not to put God in a box. I do try to understand God so I may create or I may share concepts in the way that I've come to understand things. But even then, that's still limited perspective. All that I do in this world is coming from a limited human being. So I can never fully grasp the enormity of what God is or what source is, but I can try. And I think I've done a better job of it for myself than through the religious faith that I grew up in. So that's where my position is at. But it is because I'm gay, because I decided to question everything, because I did not take someone else's word of mouth as truth and as gospel, that I was able to find God. So I found God through the experience and acceptance of self and my sexuality as I came, as I was, as I am. All right, back to this. Through some of those men and women, schools or movements developed within all major religions that represented not only a rediscovery, but in some cases, an intensification of the light of the original teaching. This is how Gnosticism and mysticism came into existence in early and medieval Christianity. Sufism in the Islamic religion, Hasidism and Kabbalah in Judaism, Advaita Vedanta, in Hinduism, Zen, and Darshan in Buddhism. I know I butchered some of those words, but please forgive me. Most of these schools were iconoclastic. They did always with layers upon layers of deadening and conceptualization and mental belief structures. And for this reason, most of them were viewed with suspicion and often hostility by the established religion hierarchies. Unlike mainstream religion, their teachings emphasized realization and inner transformation. It is through those esoteric schools or movements that the major religions regained the transformative power of the original teachings, although in most cases only a small minority of people had access to them. Their numbers were never large enough to have any significant impact on the deep collective unconsciousness of the majority. Over time, some of those schools themselves became too rigidly formalized or conceptualized to remain effective. Spirituality and religion. What is the role of the established religions in the arising of the new consciousness? Many people are already aware of the difference between spirituality and religion. They realize that having a belief system, a set of thoughts that you regard as the absolute truth, does not make you spiritual no matter what the nature of those beliefs is. In fact, the more you make your thoughts beliefs into your identity, the more cut off you are from the spiritual dimension within yourself. Many religious people are stuck at that level. They equate truth with thought, and as they are completely identified with thought, they claim to be in sole possession of the truth in an unconscious attempt to protect their identity. They don't realize the limitations of thought. Unless you think exactly as they do, you are wrong in their eyes. And in the not too distant past, they would have felt justified in killing you for that, and some still do even now. The new spirituality, the transformation of consciousness, is arising to a large extent outside of the structures of the existing institutionalized religions. They were always pockets of spirituality, even in mind-dominated religions, although the institutionalized hierarchies felt threatened by them and often tried to suppress them. A large-scale opening of spirituality outside of the religious structures is an entirely new development. In the past, this would have been inconceivable, especially in the West, the most mind-dominated of all cultures, where the Christian church had a virtual franchise on spirituality and monopoly. They had a monopoly and franchise on spirituality. You couldn't just stand up and give a spiritual talk or publish a spiritual book unless you were sanctioned by the church. If you were not, they would quickly silence you. But now, even within certain churches and religions, there are signs of change. It is heartwarming, and one is grateful for even the slightest signs of openness, such as Pope John Paul II visiting a mosque as well as a synagogue. Partly as a result of the spiritual teachings that have arisen outside the established religions, but also due to an influx of the ancient Eastern wisdom teachings. A growing number of followers of traditional religions are able to let go of identification with form, dogma, and rigid belief systems and discover the original depth that is hidden within their own spiritual tradition at the same time as they discover the depth within themselves. They realize that how spiritual you are has nothing to do with what you believe, but everything to do with your state of consciousness. This, in turn, determines how you act in the world and interact with others. Those unable to look beyond form become even more deeply entrenched in their beliefs, that is to say, in their mind. We are witnessing not only an unprecedented influx of consciousness at this time, but also an entrenchment and intensification of the ego. Some religious institutions will be open to the new consciousness. Others will harden their doctrinal positions and become part of all those other man-made structures through which the collective ego will defend itself and fight back. Some churches, sects, cults, or religious movements are basically collective egoic entities, as rigidly identified with their mental positions as the followers of any political ideology that is closed to any alternative interpretation of reality. But the ego is destined to dissolve, and all its ossified structures, whether they be religious or other institutions, corporations, or governments, will disintegrate from within, no matter how deeply entrenched they appear to be. The most rigid structures, the most impervious to change, will collapse first. This has already happened in the case of Soviet communism. How deeply entrenched, how solid and monolithic it appeared, and yet within a few years it disintegrated from within. Oh, it disintegrated from within. Sorry, thought it was a different word. No one foresaw this. All were taken by surprise. There are many more such surprises in store for us. The urgency of transformation. When faced with a radical crisis, when the old way of being in the world, of interacting with each other and with the realm of nature doesn't work anymore, when survival is threatened by seemingly insurmountable problems, an individual life form or a species will either die or become extinct, or rise above the limitations of its condition through an evolutionary leap. It is believed that the life forms on this planet first evolved in the sea. When there were no animals yet to be found on land, the sea was already teeming with life. Then at some point, one of the sea creatures must have started to venture into dry land. It would perhaps crawl a few inches at first, then, exhausted by the enormous gravitational pull of the planet, it would return to the water, where gravity is almost non-existent and where it could live with much greater ease. And then it tried again and again and again, and much later would adapt to life on land, grow feet instead of fins, develop lungs instead of gills. It seems unlikely that a species would venture into such an alien environment and undergo an evolutionary transformation unless it was compelled to do so by some crisis situation. There may have been a large sea area that got cut off from the main ocean, where the water gradually receded over thousands of years, forcing fish to leave their habitat and evolve. Responding to a radical crisis that threatens our very survival, this is humanity's challenge now. The dysfunction of the egoic human mind, recognized already more than 2,500 years ago by the ancient wisdom teachers and now magnified through science and technology, is for the first time threatening the survival of the planet. Until very recently, the transformation of human consciousness, also pointed to by the ancient teachers, was no more than a possibility, realized by a few rare individuals here and there, irrespective of cultural or religious background. A widespread flowering of human consciousness did not happen because it was not yet imperative. A significant portion of the Earth's population will soon recognize, if they haven't already done so, that humanity is now faced with a stark choice: evolve or die. A still relatively small but rapidly growing percentage of humanity is already experiencing within themselves the breakup of the old egoic mind patterns and the emergence of a new dimension of consciousness. What is arising now is not a new belief system, a new religion, spiritual ideology, or mythology. We are coming to the end not only of mythologies, but also of ideologies and belief systems. The change goes deeper than the content of your mind, deeper than your thoughts. In fact, at the heart of the new consciousness lies the transcendence of thought, the newfound ability of rising above thought, of realizing a dimension within yourself that is infinitely more vast than thought. You then no longer derive your identity, your sense of who you are, from the incessant stream of thinking that in the old consciousness you take to be yourself. What a liberation to realize that the voice in my head is not who I am. Who am I then? The one who sees that, the awareness that is prior to thought, the space in which the thought or the emotion or sense perception happens. Ego is no more than this: identification with form, which primarily means thought forms. If evil has any reality, and it has a relative, not an absolute, reality, this is also its definition: complete identification with form. Physical forms, thought forms, emotional forms. This results in a total unawareness of my connectedness with the whole, my intrinsic oneness with every other, as well as with the source. This forgetfulness is original sin, suffering, delusion. When this delusion of utter separateness underlies and governs whatever I think, say, and do, what kind of world do I create? To find the answer to this, observe how humans relate to each other. Read a history book, or watch the news on television tonight. If the structures of the human mind remain unchanged, we will always end up recreating fundamentally the same world, the same evils, the same dysfunction. A new heaven and a new earth. The inspiration for the title of this book came from a biblical prophecy that seems more applicable now than at any other time in human history. It occurs in both the Old and the New Testament and speaks of the collapse of the existing world order and the arising of a new heaven and a new earth. We need to understand here that heaven is not a location, but refers to the inner realm of consciousness. This is esoteric, meaning of the word, and this is also its meaning in the teachings of Jesus. Earth, on the other hand, is the outer manifestation in form, which is always a reflection of the inner. Collective human consciousness and life on our planet are intrinsically connected. A new heaven is the emergence of a transformed state of human consciousness, and a new earth is its reflection in the physical realm. Since human life and human consciousness are intrinsically one with the life of the planet, as the old consciousness dissolves, there are bound to be synchronistic, geographic, and climatic natural upheavals in many parts of the planet, some of which we are already witnessing now. And then we'll stop there because that's the end of the chapter. All right, so it's interesting when he talks about the biblical prophecies and stuff. It's funny because even though I no longer identify with being Catholic, I still very much refer to the material, especially the older material or the material that didn't go through so much translative changes over the centuries. Today, like, sometimes when I'm seeing, like, when I see all the stuff in the world that's going on each day, and at this point, I just don't watch the news unless I need to catch up on what's going on. So I watch the news maybe once or twice a week, just because I still need to know what's happening. But I just try to avoid watching regular news and spending hours, like, engrossed in all of the crazy drama that we put ourselves through as humans. But, the world is a chaotic place. It's been a chaotic place. It's going to continue to be a chaotic place to some extent. There isn't going to be a moment in time where all of the people who have a difference of opinion are going to disappear. It's not going to happen. What will happen is that we are going to butt up and hit and slam head on into reality, the reality of the situation and the circumstances that we all face, not just some of us in one party and group or some of us in another party or group. We are all going to face the same challenges. We're all going to slam into reality. Though we may think that our political ideologies are the main focus, it really isn't. Those are just secondary issues compared to what we're dealing with on a collective conscious level on this planet. And so as things continue to change, as we continue to have more climate change, more effects from the planet, Mother Nature's done. She's like, I've let y'all bitches run amok, and now it's time for me to have mine. That's what Mother Nature's doing right now. And so I've been seeing, and I try not to feel like, oh my God, this is like, there's no hope. I don't let myself go that route, because I'm like, there's always hope. There's always the opportunity for things to get better. And we don't live on a planet with a bunch of people who are not capable. We live on a planet with a bunch of people who are capable. And so there will be a way through all of this, even if it costs a lot of conflicts and unfortunately wars and to some extent deaths are part of that whole process. It's always been the case. But I've been asking God personally, because I'm just like, what do I do? Or like, what am I supposed to focus on? And God's like, focus on what you've already been focused on. Focus on your path, on your work. It still matters. No matter what's happening in the world, you can't save the world. You can just focus on your work and do what you do best. And so that's the advice I've been given. I'm like, okay, that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to stay in my lane. Speak truth whenever you have the opportunity, but stay in your lane. And so I try to speak truth as often as I can. And truth that I think people need to hear, whether they agree with me or not. You can disagree with me, but if I tell you need to look both ways before you cross the street, and you simply refuse to, at some point your luck's gonna run out, and either you're gonna watch someone else get their ass run over, or you're gonna get your ass run over. And so at some point reality is gonna hit you, and then you have to deal with that, and you have to account for that, and you have to be accountable to yourself, because I'm not the one who's benefiting from that. You're the one that's benefiting from it by reducing the impact and the threat to yourself. But when I think about this, and I've been asking God, like, how is this all gonna play out? I keep hearing the same thing over and over again in my mind. the meek shall inherit the earth. And I'm like, what do you mean the meek shall inherit the earth? And the idea of the meek, what I am told is that the meek represents people who honor and acknowledge what is and do not dismiss the acts of God or the will of God, the real threats that we face, but who acknowledge and accept and begin to work in either adapting to those changes and adapting to those threats or work to improve them. And so I'm like, okay, so what are you saying? So like the meek shall inherit the earth. Do not go against the reality of what is, because that is God. Accept and know your place in that. Just because you think something doesn't mean the world will change. The world is as it should be and will continue as it is supposed to. Acknowledge what is happening, acknowledge what has occurred, and acknowledge what can be. And know your place in it, and strive and focus on your place within the conscious collectiveness of humanity, and do what you can, and focus on what you can, and know your place, because the meek shall inherit the earth. And that's what I keep being told over and over again. The meek shall inherit the earth. Those who do not fight what is reality, those who do not try to dominate others as the only force, those who acknowledge the realities of this world and still work within it and try to improve it, that's the meek. And so I'm like, okay. And I think that can be applied in so many different situations and in so many different circumstances. So I think that's what it comes down to, in my opinion. But let me go through what you guys are saying, see what you guys have to say about this. Remember, guys, no personal readings. This is study group time. So any questions or comments need to be focused on the material, or need to be have to deal with topics that are spiritual in nature. Yeah, Cassidy's like, she's like, so crazy that people often believe the same things, but because they name it or word it differently, they hate each other. Yeah, I think when you sit people's asses down and you're like, what do you believe or what do you want? They essentially want the same basic things. They just believe in different ways of achieving it, or they believe that they don't have it because of specific ideologies or mindsets. So it gets challenging because you need people to be on the same page. And what I believe is that if you just start with what is reality versus what is a belief, then that's a good starting point, because you're acknowledging what just is, what's the case, what's the situation, and then you're using that as a starting point to move forward and to build off of. But when you start in a place where your belief is a reality, but the reality is not substantiated and is not affirmed by the larger reality, by the collective reality that we all share, that's when you run into issues, because again, it will implode and it will collapse in on itself. And I think that's what we're finding. We're finding situations, not just in this country, but around the world, where movements or groups or individuals who have operated a certain way, they're these organizations or these people, it's collapsing within itself. I would use the Catholic Church as an example because I'm Catholic, so I was born Catholic, so I have the right to bash them all I want. The Catholic faith has been responsible for more atrocities than some of the worst wars. I mean, 700 million people dying in the Inquisition, during the Inquisition period, and just during the reign of the Catholic Church, basically affirming their own policies. That includes people who were in the Americas who were killed by the Catholic Church. We're hearing about all of the bodies that they're finding under these schools that children were forced to go to be conditioned into aligning with what the Catholic Church wanted. And yet we're finding and we're seeing organizations like the Catholic Church refusing to account for themselves. They're refusing to take accountability. They're refusing to acknowledge that they're infallible. They're refusing to acknowledge that they're a man-made organization or structure that was meant to do one thing, but in its history has done the opposite and has committed some of the worst atrocities on this planet. And so we are now seeing the beginnings of an implosion happening within the Catholic faith. And you're already starting to see that now in like Canada, where they're burning down these Catholic churches. Some of these churches that have been around for a few hundred years are being burnt down or being destroyed. I don't necessarily agree with that approach, because I'm not the kind of person to think that that's the way to handle things. But I definitely agree that the church needs to be held accountable. And if they refuse to be accountable to their own actions and behaviors, even if they're historical, doesn't matter. You historically, this is what you've done for 2 millennia. So historically, you have 2 millennia to make up for, to try to right. So take accountability. Own your shit. If you don't own your shit, and if you're not accountable to yourself, then you need to be held accountable. And if you refuse to hold yourself accountable, and then governments or organizations of people need to hold them accountable. Now, what they're doing is they're just like lighting them churches on fire and they're burning them down. Again, I don't agree with that's the way to handle it. However, when you have enough people who are angry or feel betrayed or feel like they've been screwed over and over again, and even when it's clearly obvious to any basic sense, through any basic sense of morality, the sense of morality being that when you are responsible for a child and you take the child's life, that's not a good thing. And so it doesn't require science to figure that out. It's an immoral act. And when you have hundreds of, not thousands of children who have been murdered or killed in the name of a faith or religion or a practice or an organization, which it's a monopoly, an organization, it's a franchisement. At that point, you still refuse, then you're setting yourself up for a reckoning that you may not even be able to control. And so you get angry people who are not vindicated, there's no justice. You get people getting crazy and they go to extremes, because in any group, in any organization, in any grouping of people on this planet, doesn't matter whether you're right, left, up, down, doesn't matter. There are extreme people in every side of a perspective. And extreme people are not going to wait for someone to make things right. Extreme people are going to react and respond. And in many cases, it's violent. And so you have to acknowledge crap. You have to acknowledge it. You can't just sweep it under the rug and hope that people are going to just ignore it or just get over it. No, like you cannot. And we're at a point in our world civilization because of the internet, it has tied us all together. Just like the Tower of Babylon. The Tower of Babel, where it connected all people with language, this is the same thing. And so people have been brought together and now have been empowered and have now been given a sense of control in this world through what they have access to. And so now there's more of a unifying consciousness that's starting to take place. Even though we have variations and we have, we have different groups still, and there's still a lot of divisiveness, but there's also a collective intertwining that is happening where you can't help but understand and know that I'm not the only person that feels the way that I do. And other people, many of you, are seeing the world and the events play out and are having personal experiences. And there are truths that are being revealed through those experiences, even if they're painful. There are truths being revealed through all of that. They're our greatest teachers. And so because of the wisdom that many of us are gaining through these experiences and through the observation and witnessing of this world, the energy, the mindset, the ideas, the perspectives will begin to coalesce and will begin to become similar. And you'll be having collections of people coming together in unified mind. And that's just where we're headed. But, it's happening at the same time as all of the old models and all of the old ways of operating are no longer sustainable and can no longer be allowed to continue because they are destructive, they are dangerous, and they have produced only harm in this world. So there's a lot of this old with new conflictive energies here. We're going through a representation of the apocalypse. We're going through a representation of the end times. All that represents is the clash between good and evil. People are thinking that there's going to be devils flying around and then angels flying around, and then God is going to be on a throne and Lucifer or Satan's going to be on the throne, and they're going to be fighting with lightning bolts. It's not, get real, y'all. Those are based on old mythologies from old other religious beliefs and stuff like that. It ain't gonna happen like that. We are the devils and we are the angels. It is us. We are that. And it is represented in each of us, both sides, both aspects, both angles, both perspective. All of it is within us. And so we're fighting amongst ourselves between the righteous morality of just basic truth and survival, and health and wellness and positivity or love, and fear and, oppression and anger and disillusionment and hatred. And so we are the angels and the demons fighting amongst ourselves. So the war's on. It's happening right now, and it is happening on an individual level within each and every one of us. It is happening in a cultural level. It's happening on a political level. It's happening on a faith or spiritual level. It's happening in every single level. And so it is here. It is now. And so this is just and this is not the first time this has occurred, by the way, guys. Like, this is a theme that happens every so often within any cultural civilization. Like, there's periods where you go through this trial by fire. And that's what we're doing. We're going through trial by fire, but we're the judges of our own court. We are the executioners of our own dead. We are the saviors of our own collective consciousness and culture and civilization. So all of that is within us and is sponsored and supported and reflected within all of us. And so we are reckoning within ourselves as a world, as a civilization. Yes, it's about control. Yeah, it definitely is about control. Controlled by fear, and God is not. God is pure love and forgiveness. It depends on what religion you believe, because if you come from a religion where God is vindictive and angry, and this whole oh man is I'm gonna get you for hurting me. Okay, God, you're perfect. Why would you even feel threatened by what I'm doing? You're a God. You're all things. Why would little old me? Why would that bother you? Because all you have to do is just wish me to not be, and that's it. I'm gone. It's all fixed, right? So why is not that? And so all of these contradictions that people run into. But it depends on what religious belief you believe in. Because if people believe that their God is the God that they connect with, is a vindictive, nasty, hateful, then that's where they're going to operate within, and they just don't know any better. They have never experienced the loving God. They only think they have, but they really haven't, because you can't support those two things at the same time. But it just depends on how you want to look at it. God is all things, in my opinion, all of it, positive, negative, all of it is God, because God is the witness of all of it, not the producer of it. We are the producer. We've been given free will to create amongst ourselves as we choose, and we're living out those expressions. God is the witnessing aspect of that within each and every one of us. You have to understand that Revelation, because this Revelation shows the time frame and how it will transpire. Revelation has been if I go to a store today and I buy the first Bible that I see and I read Revelation, and I buy into that, I don't consider myself to be reading anything that is even close to accurate. And the reason why is because a lot of the material you find in the traditional Bibles has been rebooted and completely rebranded several times. And when you say, Revelation shows a time frame, which Bible are you reading? Because there's over 50. Which Bible are you referring to? Because they all have subtle differences. And not only that, not all of them include, Revelation. So it just depends on what you're referring to. And then on top of that, take into account the fact that all of those versions have been rebooted and rebranded over the past 2,000 years. So you cannot even expect that that's close to accurate to what was originally written down. And what was originally written down was written down by people who were not first witnesses. In most cases, they were people who were just, collecting the stories or collecting the what had already been passed around and then including it or bringing it into fruition. And if you start like with the Gospel of Mark, which is the earliest gospel, not Matthew, but Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So if you start with Mark's is a more stripped down version of the Gospels. And then if you look at the one after that, 10 years later or 15 years later, then it's got some embellishments. Then you look at the next one, it's got some embellishments. And then they all include material that was never even included in the Mark's gospel. Some of that material was included in the Q material, which is a gospel that has never been found, but that is obviously holds material that some of them got their material from. So there's a lot of intermixing and there's a lot of rebranding, rehashing, rebooting, and a lot of change that has happened. So I don't take the Bible literally, and I can't, because common sense tells us that people have a habit of being messy. And when you get people in the church who even refuse to acknowledge where they've messed up, to act as if everything that has been done has been 100% perfect, by default already, that's a problem. The earliest book that the Christians have, that the Vatican even has a hold of, is from the 4th century. So it's not even near as old as some of the earliest gospels, and there are gospels earlier than that contradict what was written later on. So you just have to, it depends on what you look into. And also, a lot of the material in the biblical text was never meant to be read by the commoner, meaning that most people were illiterate. They could not read and they could not understand a lot of the symbolism and meaning in many of these stories. And a lot of these stories were written by prophets, like myself, prophets, people who could sense and see and understand things from a much deeper and symbolic perspective. It was never meant to be taken literally. They may have been inspired to create or to speak on some of the events or stories that they wrote about. They may have been inspired by their time, the context of their culture. They may have been inspired by a lot of these things, but you have to take it all within context, because it doesn't translate into 2,000 years later when the world is a very different place. Cassie's like, I think God gave you some great and much needed advice for all of us. I think everybody's getting the same advice, but not everybody's getting it in the same way. But I think everybody is getting one way or another, getting a version of something. And even then, and I would say this, Cassidy, people who I've run into in the last year, because I do a lot of dream interpretation. That's one of my services that I offer people. And so they can shoot me a dream, and then I'll interpret it for them. And several instances in the last year, I ran into people who were very different than I, who had very different beliefs, very opposite beliefs and perspectives than I. And yet when you look at their dreams are telling them the same thing that I've been saying. The dreams are saying the same things, but yet they are vehemently connected and attached to their perspectives or their opinions. And so they dismiss what they're being told and what they're being given by source or by their inner being. They ignore it and they stick to what they believe. But when you go back over the dreams, it's like you're being guided. You're being told what you need to know. You just refuse to accept it, or you just will not acknowledge it, So it just depends on the person. I had one person whose dream was telling them that their position on certain things was going to cause them to feel embarrassed and to feel ashamed, because the truth of what actually would be revealed, and they would feel embarrassed and as if they had no validity to speak on things in the future, and they would feel like they didn't have a place to say because they were wrong about this big thing. And sure enough, things happened, and that's how they felt, but they still maintain some of those. Some of this, you gotta think, people, if you're being guided by source, if you're being guided by your inner being, I'm not telling you these things. I'm just obviously, and you can see the obviousness of the messaging. It's what are you doing? You're being told this, so that's why I feel that's why I always feel more confident in what I say, because even though I can say what I can say, right? People say, well, Ferny, that's your opinion. Like, you're not infallible. You're not perfect. Hell no, I'm not perfect. And hell no, I'm not infallible. But there are a lot of things that I'm very, very insistent and very like attached to in the way that I hold my position and views on certain things. And it gets affirmed. And if it's not affirmed and I'm running into something that is definitely showing me that I'm wrong, I have to stop and question and reassess what I've done. And I'll own up to that and I acknowledge that. But whenever I'm holding to a position, and not only do I start to get affirmed, then I also get affirmed by the people who hold opposite positions than myself. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm in the best path for us to get through this. I think I'm on the road to our goal. But you're like taking the side streets and it's not leading you anywhere, and you're ending up in like potholes. So you got to line back up. I don't ever like to say I'm right and you're wrong. I like to say that I have a position or a mindset that has me aligned with the goal that we all want. You just haven't realized yet, and you haven't figured it out yet. Doesn't mean you're wrong. Just doesn't mean that. It just means that what you're trying to do ain't gonna get you to where you're trying to go. And so you probably need to like look at that and pay attention to that. So that's why I can get very like aggressive with my positions, because I'm like, nope, I'm not doing it. I'm not changing. And I'm a bull, I'm a Taurus. So like, I'm really stubborn, as well. Cassie's like, I was waiting to see that battle in the sky. No such a thing. No such a thing. Yeah. It's like, 21st, I was like, a pastor told me not to meditate. I was from Satan. A pastor molested me, for a while. So, you can't trust a pastor, because a pastor is a human being who is dealing with human conditions. So you have to take every person and really pay attention. You don't just automatically assume because someone is a pastor that they are a good person. Because actually, in my experience, many a times, most of the pastors that I've met have been the most judgmental and just downright awful human beings that I've ever encountered. So if anything, it's quite the opposite. And if anything, the people who are running around, calling themselves devil worshippers or Satan worshippers have actually shown more kindness in this world and don't do a lot of harm to others. So it's an interesting thing to see with people. I'm not saying that's the way to go, because the idea of Satan is a made-up imaginary idea. When you read that in passages, Satan is not a real person. Satan is representative of our shadow self. And so when you see passages that mention, this, there's one that I just made a note about as well. It was Jesus. Jesus was in a mosque. Was he in a mosque, or was he in he was in a temple, and he was giving a sermon. He was giving guidance and telling people. And there was a man there who was also a preacher or a rabbi, and had it issue with Jesus and the way he was teaching. And so he started to speak up and go off and mouth off and criticize, and he exposed himself as this just really vile person, and in the way that he was speaking to the crowd, speaking to Jesus, and just speaking on the whole thing. But they refer to it as he had become possessed by Satan. There was no devil forcing him to be this. He basically connected with his shadow self and exposed himself, expressed himself in this nature. So the idea of, that's something of Satan is actually a referral. It's referring to the idea that someone has connected to their darker self, darker tendencies, shadow being, and express that in a way that goes against the love of God or the love of life. So it's a representation. It's not an actual person. So when you read those stories in the Bible, do not assume that they're talking about a physical demon or being called Satan. They're referring to an aspect of the person's nature or being, or an aspect of themselves in that situation. That doesn't mean it carries over forever. Yeah, the Cozy's Lace is like, are those blue light glasses? They are blue light glasses. My vision is perfect. I don't have any issues with my vision. But I wear my glasses because sometimes I have to stare on the screen so long. That's all I do all day, right? I'm on the screen, so I don't want to. Plus, I love the feeling of glasses because by default, I automatically feel more intelligent. And so it gives me a little more confidence. So that's one of the reasons why I wear glasses as well. Okay, it's going there. And then over here. Hey, Michelle. Michelle, your the loved one that passed away for you, she's going to show up as a bird. She's going to show up as a red robin. So keep an eye out for her. Have that show up. Okay? I just had a robin show up for me. That's why I was looking outside and looking at it. Yeah. This is hell in heaven. This is where it exists because this is duality. So all of that can exist here, Michelle. Absolutely. Yeah, Michelle, like baptism is overrated. It was actually so a lot of people don't realize this, but John the Baptist was a lot more well known or was a bigger deal than Jesus at the time. With Yeshua, his name is Yeshua. Again, they were cousins. People don't realize they were cousins. And so they grew up together, and John the Baptist had grown up around a lot of the he grew up around a lot of the Pharisees. So did Jesus. They both grew up around Pharisees. They were kind of taught to be they were taught to be rabbis. And so, but John wasn't having it. He didn't really want to go into the traditional path of becoming a rabbi and being a part of the temple or the church complex. He was against it, just the way it's almost like, I'm not going to become a priest. I'm going to do something different. And so it's almost like someone going into something in a little bit of a different way. So he believed more in saving yourself, but he also was like, things are about to get crazy and things are going to go down, and you need to be prepared for how things are going to go down, because he was a prophet as well. So he was a psychic, so he could see things. And so John the Baptist he became a very big deal in that area. And Jesus was kind of like one of his followers. So Jesus used to follow John and learned a lot from him, because Jesus was kind of like a go-between. Like he had studied and he had done a lot with the he kind of went against the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the sect or the grouping of priests who kind of dominated the Jerusalem church, the Temple Mount. And then the Pharisees were more of the go-betweens. They were like the workers where if you are dealing with something and you're trying to find the best way to kind of stay within the law, the Torah, if you're trying to stay within the laws, but at the same time, those laws were created back in a time when it didn't really apply in some instances to their culture at that time in first AD, the first century CE. The Pharisees would be guides to people. They would offer them their own ideas and opinions on how people could still support and maintain those laws while also honoring the circumstances of the moment. And so they gave people ways to still stay within the alignment of the laws of Moses. So the Pharisees always were finding ways to kind of, it's almost like it's here's an example. It's almost like, for example, my taxes, right? I had to set up an LLC and an S corp for my business, just because my business is a legit business. I pay crap load of taxes, but I'm registered with the IRS. They know who I am because they get paid by me on a regular basis. And so, but I'm not trying to pay a whole lot. I'm not trying to pay more than I need to. And so I have a tax architect, a tax guy, who helped to structure the way my business was set up so that I could still make sure I'm paying taxes that are required while also being able to put more towards retirement, to put more towards, doing this and doing that. And so my tax architect has helped me to set things up so that I can reduce my tax liability while still managing my responsibilities, but also being able to live my life and do what I need to do for myself as well. And so, that's like a Pharisee. Back then, the Pharisee helps you to kind of get around some of the stringent laws to kind of help you to still maintain the integrity of those laws while also giving you ways to do it in a different way that still honors things. So that's who the Pharisees were. And John the Baptist, he just went against the Sadducees, which were the traditional priesthood, and he had learned more from the Essenes. The Essenes were very strict in the way that they followed along, and the Essenes were another group that kind of lived out in the desert as well. But John was kind of like wandering the desert. He lived a lot of life in the desert. Think of people who I'm done with the government. I'm done with being in the city. I'm going to go and live out in a tent somewhere in the middle of nowhere and just live my own life and live my best life. That's John the Baptist. So he was very much of even though, and I could understand why he would be a prophet, because that helps you to become more psychic. But he isolated himself, and he kind of steered away from the major city centers, and he built a following. People definitely respected him, and he built a lot of gatherers, and there would be thousands of people who would show up to listen to him speak and so forth. And he got himself into trouble because he started to basically question and call out Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was one of the ruling individuals in that area, and so Herod Antipas was doing some really shady things, and John the Baptist had called him out on it, and so Herod Antipas was not having it. So he basically took John, he imprisoned him for a year, and then he cut off his head. While he was in prison for a year, or jail for a year, Jesus was like, well, someone's got to step up, because all these people are still waiting around for John, and all these people are coming to John, and I feel like I need to step up to the plate. And so Jesus was like, let me step up. And John, one of his big things was just to baptize people, because sometimes when we go through life and we go through trauma and we go through stuff and we become people that we don't really feel proud of, we need a chance to start over, and we need the opportunity to start over. And I think that's what was happening there. John was giving people who were not lined up with the traditional religious methods. John was giving people a chance to start all over and to make themselves right in the eyes of God and in the eyes of the religious faith. And so he was giving people a chance for just renewal. And so Jesus had his own history, and he had definitely done some shady things himself growing up and evolving. Even though he was very educated, he came from a family that at that point had definitely established its own wealth. And so he was following along John. Once John got imprisoned, then Jesus stepped up to the plate and said, I'm going to take over. So he took over. This is not a lot of stuff that is commonly talked about, because the way the Gospels present the information is very much changed every single time. So you start with the first one, there's a lot more truth and alignment with what I'm saying. And then when you keep going forward into the Gospels that followed that were embellished, they changed it. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were preparing the teachings of Christ and the story of Christ for the Greek-speaking audience, for the people who were Romans, not for the Jewish people, which was the bulk of what Jesus was focused in. And so he took over and he began to minister, and he kind of took on all those crowds, and then it grew and expanded even more so. And interestingly, he had a lot of connections. He had connections and people who were following him, who were his followers, who actually contributed money. These are in the Gospels. Read it, guys. They contributed money to some of his earliest churches or some of his earliest temples, where he was teaching his sermons and ministry. So a lot of these people who were wealthy Romans were contributing money to his movement and his following. At the same time, you have also John still locked up, and then you have other people who were connected to Herod Antipas who were also followers of Jesus. So it's almost like they were like, you don't know what to believe at that point, because if the chief of staff of the guy who has your cousin locked up, who is about to have him killed, beheaded, if that person's chief of staff, that person's hand man is also one of your followers, or their wife is one of your followers, at that point it's like, well, that's a little interesting detail there that doesn't make a lot of sense. So he was very connected. He was very well connected, which is why he was able to expand his movement so quickly, so fast, because he went about it in a very strategic way. A lot of people don't know these things because they don't read these things. So anyways, all right, guys, I think I'm done because I got to get to getting. So I love you all. Thanks so much for tuning in. I will be back on Friday for our next